God has certainly given us a beautiful day. And as we come into Sunday and then Monday, it is indeed a time for us to remember and reflect and appreciate those who have given their lives so that we as Americans can experience great freedom. I want to say thanks for joining me today. And I am continuing a series entitled The Fabric of Life. And we are looking at the topic of godly poise. We certainly need that today. 4 weeks ago, we started a journey in Ecclesiastes, and as we read the first words of this book, it didn't take us long to discover that the author of this book was going to be saying something very important to us. He was going to look deeply into our lives. When he began, meaningless, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. And I'm not looking for you to get discouraged or depressed today, but it's important you understand what he meant and how the Bible has been used and translated from this passage. That word meaningless is hebel in the original language, and it means that life is like a vapor. It's here one moment and it's gone. It was not that Solomon was saying that there's no meaning in living, but that what we spend our life doing is transient. It is here one moment and then is gone. By the time we came to the end of chapter 2, 4 weeks ago, we had made a significant discovery concerning this vaporous life, as we found that while everything is a vapor, it is God who can provide purpose in life. For without him, Solomon says, who can eat or find enjoyment? You see, the key is to be in relationship with God, our Creator. Well, 3 weeks ago, we looked at time and we discovered that there is a time and a season for everything. And that none of us, neither you nor myself, we do not control time or circumstances, but we can trust God who does and who has given us time as a gift. We also discovered that we were not created for 50 years or 60 or 70 years, but we were created for eternity. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the topic of injustice, and we looked at all of the ways that people try to deal with injustice. Some deny that it exists. They kind of got the head in the sand approach. Others gloss over injustice with cliches. And then others seek to blame others. But the author of Ecclesiastes confessed a faith in God that one day God would deal with the injustices of life. And I shared with you some real practical steps that day on how to live a life in a world of injustice. In fact, I reminded you that don't be surprised when somebody mistreats you or you experience injustice. And don't let what you cannot destroy, what you cannot understand, destroy what you can enjoy. And don't live in constant fear of what might happen to you. Recognize who you are in comparison to God, that he is the creator and we are his creatures. But realize that God's going to deal with injustice. And look for God's love in places that you would be probably missing it from time to time. Last week we talked a lot about profit. There will always be someone who has more than you. In fact, if you love money, you will never have enough. As your wealth increases, so does your responsibility and your anxiety. And lastly, all of us, no matter what we amass, we never take it with us. I closed last week by asking, as a follower of Jesus Christ, how can we profit? And I gave you some real practical steps. I asked you to listen to God, to offer God a true sacrifice, your very life, and to be slow to speak. And I wasn't talking about the pace of your conversation. I was telling you how easy and quick it is for us to judge others, but that we need to avoid doing that very thing. Well, I want to jump into the message today. And I want to say thanks for joining me. One of the most interesting things, and I'm in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and 9, one of the interesting features of the book of Ecclesiastes is that God is seemingly silent throughout the entire book. There are no "thus saith the Lord." There is no place where it says God says. It appears as one reads this book that God is silent. And most of us believe, at least most of us, we have concluded that we know how God should act on our behalf, especially during times of trouble and difficulty. Well, at the very least, we want an explanation from God about the whys of our life and how long are we going to have to endure suffering and calamity. At the heart of this passage is a topic of control. How are we to live our life if we are not in control? And if we're not in control, then who is in control? And what can they do to bring about change? And is there anything that we can do to bring change? Surely someone has to be in charge or in control of this. Can anyone explain this? Well, that's what Solomon says, chapter 8, verse 1. Who is like the wise man? Who knows the explanation of things? Now, in this passage, Solomon is going to suggest to us that we live our lives not by our own understanding, but by living a life of godly poise. And I've got to talk to you about that today, especially in light of the fact that so many people in our culture, so many people in our nation, in our world, are struggling today of understanding how to live in the midst of the days and the weeks that we have been experiencing. Now, poise is the ability to have balance when things are unstable, composure when life is difficult, and a dignified self-manner when God is silent. Do you find yourself seeking God's wisdom, or are you trying to understand the events of your life? You know, Solomon elsewhere wrote in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, lean not on your own understanding. You know, there is no better place to go when you and I are experiencing life and difficulties and problems than the Bible. I encourage you, even this week, to turn off your TV and get into the Word of God. Seek godly wisdom rather than understanding. There's a second thing I need to say to you. Recognize our place with those in authority. It's found in verse 2. He says, obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. You know, Solomon knew the average person sometime in their life was not about to respond to those in authority. And they would be tempted to ask, what in the world are you doing? Or what are you thinking? Solomon reminds us to obey those in authority, and that we should be slow in our actions, that we should be considerate, recognizing that God has allowed that person to be in authority. You see, we're living in a day where the mantra is to challenge authority, to disrespect authority, to do what we want to do when we want to do it. When life is difficult and God is silent, Solomon is saying, have godly poise. Rather than rushing to judgment or taking matters into our own hands, submit to those that God has placed in authority. You see, it takes trust and patience in God to submit to a human being who is in a power of authority over you. I'm reminded of the great story that's told about David and King Saul. David, as a young boy, had been selected, anointed to be the next king following King Saul by the prophet Samuel. But King Saul became very jealous. I mean, who wouldn't if you already knew who was going to replace you? And so King Saul seeks to kill David, and David runs for his life. And some of you know what it's like to run. Some of you are running even right now with the pandemic that we have had, and you're trying to figure out, what do I do in this moment? Do I go here? Do I wear a mask? Should my church be open? Should my church not be open? You see, we all know what it's like to have God's call on our life, and yet instead of receiving a blessing and encouragement, life gets complicated. And then there was a moment that happened for David that I think some of us wish we would have had. In our difficulties, in our pain, and in our problems, For in that moment, he had a chance for revenge. As David and his men are hiding from King Saul, they go into a cave. And amazingly, King Saul goes into that cave to relieve himself. David is so close that he is able to cut a piece of the robe from King Saul. King Saul leaves, and David walks out, and he shouts to the king and ultimately shows him the cut piece of robe, demonstrating that he was not about to touch the Lord's anointed. In fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 6, it says, "The Lord forbid," David says, "that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." I want you to know that David possessed godly poise. He was not about to take matters into his own hands. I want you to know you are not in control of your life. And that drives some of you absolutely crazy. But when life is out of control, that does not mean that you have to be out of control. And just because you desire to act doesn't mean that you need to act or react. Seek God, seek his wisdom, be people of godly poise. You see, when you're doing what God has asked you to do, you do not have to be worried or afraid. So watch how you respond to those in authority. Watch how you're responding to your pastor, to those who are leading your community and our states, our country, and our world. You see, when life is difficult and God seems silent, I would also remind you, don't try to fix every situation. You see, I've learned that God can change a moment in just a second. And he can turn our world upside down in the matter of a minute. And there are some things that cannot be fixed, and they can drive you absolutely crazy. I love the story of Daniel in the lion's den. I want you to know that Daniel, regardless of how long he had prayed or how faithful he had been to God, he was not able to solve the problem that he found himself facing. He wasn't supposed to. And could it be today that the situation that we find ourselves in is not one that God is looking for us to quick and easily fix? You see, God was trying, in the time of Daniel, he was trying to communicate to an entire nation. He was trying to communicate to the king. Another thing, when life is difficult and God is seemingly silent, don't fixate on your circumstances. Verse 6 says, "For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a person may be weighed down by misery." You see, when life is falling apart, remind yourself that there will be a time when this problem and this situation will be over. This virus is not going to last forever. The problem that you're facing one day will end. And there's going to be times when we can laugh and relax and enjoy life. There's going to be a day when God makes all things right. Change what you can. Do what you're able, but leave the rest to God. Sitting there day after day, hour after hour, stewing and fuming and fussing and worrying is not going to help you one bit. Remain poised. Don't fixate on the present circumstance you find yourself. When life is difficult and God is seemingly silent, realize what sin does to people. It enslaves them. It brings pain to them. It maims. It destroys. Verse 8 says, "As no one has power over the wind to contain it, so no one has power over the time of their death, and no one is discharged in time of war, so wickedness will not release those who practice it." If there's anything I've learned as a pastor through the years, it's simply this, that sin, it does enslave. It does hurt. It does harm people. And there are those that sometimes have hurt you by the choices that they made, that you have been impacted by sin itself. And yet it is amazing to me how God is able to redeem the people who've experienced sin firsthand. I love the story of Joseph and his brothers who got very angry and were jealous of him and threw him into the pit. And they thought ultimately his life was ending and over. But years later, these same brothers or standing in the midst of someone that they needed help from. And little did they know it was their brother. In the midst of a famine, they were able to see what God's grace is all about. That while they meant it for evil, God meant it for good. You want to talk about regrets? I want to say this to you. God can take the sinful things that people have done to you, and he can use them for good. And when it appears that God is not going to make things right, don't take matters into your own hands. Have poise. God knows what's going on. And sometimes you have to wait. Sometimes you've got to be patient. Here's another thing this passage teaches us. When life is difficult and God is silent, regardless of what happens, choose to fear God and enjoy life. There are 7 times in the book of Ecclesiastes that Solomon says, enjoy life. I want to say to you today, in spite of everything that's going on, enjoy today. Enjoy this week. Enjoy the life that God has given you. If we're not sure how or when justice is going to come, Solomon says at least it's better to fear God, to respect him, to understand that his place in this whole world is as creator. And for us to enjoy, to eat, to drink and be glad, to know God and enjoy his presence. You see, Solomon doesn't doubt the justice of God. Rather, he doubts his own ability to understand what God is doing each and every day. He concludes that it is not wise to spend each waking hour trying to figure out what God is doing in this time. Here's another thing. When life is difficult and God seems silent, rest in the silence and sovereignty of God. You know, too many people right now are living on their feelings. Too many right now are thinking that somehow, they can change everything that's happening in the world. I wish I could tell you that if you read the Bible and if you listen to sermons online or if you're able to go to church, that life is going to be excellent and painless. But Solomon reminds us that we live in a world that God has created, that God is in charge, and he is in control. You may say, well, Tim, aren't there things in your life that you wish would change? Absolutely. But I have learned that not everything can change, and not everything will change, and some of that is absolutely how it should be. You know what? I have learned that I'm not in control of everything, and that has brought peace to my heart. I don't control people's destiny. You know what? I have a hard enough time just directing my own life. But I know this. I know that when I open up the Word of God, when I read the stories of those who have gone before me, people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who trusted God, who believed that God had the ability to help them in any circumstance that they faced. And yet they said, even if God doesn't deliver us, we're going to keep believing him. We're not going to turn back away from serving God and loving God. In fact, you know what we discover in that story? Is that God shows up, whether we're in the fire or whether we're in the virus. You see, I'm learning to rest in him. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I do know who holds tomorrow. Seek godly poise. Each of us has to choose whether we're going to be a person of godly poise. You see, something is going to happen. Something unfair. Something that will break your heart. Something that if you let it will rob you of joy and life. And you may never know the reason for it. And at this moment, you will have a choice to remain faithful to God, listening to him, obeying him, trusting him, and working through your pain, or you can abandon your faith and live life on your own. Here's how Solomon concludes this section. Chapter 9, verse 1. He says, so I reflected on all this and concluded that the righteous and the wise and what they do are in God's hands. but no one knows whether love or hate awaits them. All share a common destiny, the righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad, the clean and the unclean, those who offer sacrifices and those who do not. As it is with the good, so it is with the sinful. As it is with those who take oaths, so with those who are afraid to take them. This is the evil in everything that happens under the sun. The same destiny overtakes all. The hearts of people, moreover, are full of evil, and there is madness in their hearts while they live, and afterward they join the dead. Anyone who is among the living has hope. Even a live dog is better off than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no reward, and even their name is forgotten. Their love, their hate, and their jealousy have long since vanished. Never again will they have a part in anything that happens under the sun. Go eat your food with gladness and drink your wine with a joyful heart, for God has already approved what you do. Always be clothed in wine and always anoint your head with oil. Enjoy life with your wife, whom you love all the days of this meaningful, this fast life that God has given you under the sun, all your meaningless days. For this is your lot in life, and in your toilsome labor under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for in the realm of the dead where you are going, there is neither working nor planning, nor knowledge nor wisdom. The race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned. But time and chance happen to them all. I pray that you'll have a great day. I want to thank you for joining me as I continue to walk us through the book of Ecclesiastes. I want to let you know that the fabric of life, it really is found in the one who created you. He loves you. He has a purpose and plan for your life. And you may think, what in the world does he have for me in the midst of these days? He has you being light in the midst of darkness and hope in the midst of despair. Do not be afraid, my friends. Love the Lord your God with all your might, with all your soul, and with all your strength. May God bless you. Have a great day.